How does a $100 million fortune disappear in just 4 generations? I'm Anderson Cooper. This is the story of my family and how one of the greatest fortunes in American history vanished. The name Vanderbilt once meant power and wealth, but one man chose to let it fall. My grandfather, Reggie Vanderbilt, an heir who walked away from the largest railroad empire on earth. Instead of boardrooms, he chose gambling tables. He didn't just lose money, he gambled away a dynasty. When I was a child, my mother told me something no Vanderbilt ever expected to hear. There's no trust fund. This is the dark truth behind America's richest family. Chapter 1. The Heritage of Ashes. The salt air in Newport has a way of preserving things, but it cannot preserve a legacy once the ink has dried on the final bank statement. I stand here, on the manicured cliffs behind the breakers, watching the Atlantic waves crash against the rocks just as they did a century ago. To the thousands of tourists who flock here every summer, these limestone walls represent the pinnacle of American royalty. To me, they are mausoleums. They are silent, cold reminders of a grandeur that was never meant to be permanent, though my ancestors certainly built them as if they were. I remember a quiet afternoon with my mother, Gloria Vanderbilt, in her New York apartment, a place filled with her paintings and the scent of turpentine and history. We weren't talking about the poor little rich girl headlines or the scandals that had chased her since 1934. We were talking about reality. With the same matter-of-fact grace she used to describe a piece of art, she looked at me and said, "Anderson, there is no trust fund. There is no hidden fortune. It's all gone." That moment felt like a forensic uncovering of a long-buried truth. The Vanderbilt wealth, a mountain of gold once so vast it was considered invincible, had simply evaporated. My mother was the last link to that era, a woman who had to build her own empire because the one she was born into had been liquidated by the men who came before her. Chief among them was the man whose name is whispered in our family with a mixture of pity and warning. My grandfather, Reginald Reggie Claypool Vanderbilt. To understand how it all vanished, we have to travel back to January 14th, 1880. When Reggie was born, the Vanderbilt name was not just a surname. It was a sovereign power. His grandfather, William Henry Vanderbilt, had doubled the family fortune, controlling a railroad network that functioned as the circulatory system of a surging American economy. At that time, the Vanderbilt wealth was estimated to be greater than the entire reserves of the United States Treasury. Think about that for a moment. A single family possessed more liquid power than the government of the country they lived in. Reggie's nursery was not a room. It was a sanctuary of privilege within a 70-room mansion on Fifth Avenue. He was the youngest son of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, a man who lived by a crushing sense of duty. Reggie was born into the spare position, the youngest child in a world where the eldest was groomed to rule and the others were expected to simply exist beautifully. From his first breath, he was surrounded by Italian marble, French tapestries, and an army of servants who anticipated his needs before he even knew he had them. But there was a rot beginning to set in, a psychological decay that often accompanies such absolute security. The Gilded Age was aptly named, gold on the outside, but common iron underneath. While his father worked himself to an early grave managing the New York Central Railroad, Reggie was learning that in this family, money was like the air, invisible, omnipresent, and seemingly inexhaustible. He was never taught how to earn. He was only taught how to occupy a space in society. The tragedy of Reggie Vanderbilt is not just that he spent money, but that he lacked the imagination to do anything else with it. He was a man of the 4th generation, the generation that forgets what the first generation endured. My great-great-great-grandfather, the Commodore, had started with a single, battered periauger boat, ferrying passengers across the choppy waters of New York Harbor. He was a man of grit, calluses, and a ruthless, predatory instinct. He built an empire out of wood, iron, and steam. By the time the bloodline reached Reggie, the grit had been washed away by generations of French Tudors and Newport summers. The predatory instinct had turned inward, becoming a hunger for self-indulgence rather than conquest. Reggie didn't want to build railroads. He wanted to drive the carriages they paid for. He didn't want to manage thousands of men. He wanted to be the most popular man at the card table. As I look up at the towering chimneys of the breakers, I realize that these houses were the beginning of the end. They were frozen assets, monuments to ego that cost millions to build and hundreds of thousands to maintain. They were the physical manifestation of a family that had stopped looking forward and began looking only at themselves. The Commodore's empire was a living, breathing machine of industry. Reggie's inheritance was a museum in the making. He was the prince of a dying kingdom, a man who would spend the next 4 decades proving that math is a cruel master. If you spend faster than you earn, even a fortune larger than a national treasury will eventually reach zero. The story of Reggie Vanderbilt is the story of a slow-motion shipwreck. It is the haunting realization that a monument built of solid gold can be melted down and gambled away, one night at a time, until all that is left is the name and the hollow echo of what it once meant to be a Vanderbilt. Chapter 2. Childhood in a Gilded Cage. To walk through the halls of the Vanderbilt mansion at 1 West 57th Street, the largest private residence ever built in Manhattan, was to lose oneself in a labyrinth of excess. As a journalist, I've seen world-class museums, but they pale in comparison to the scale of what Reggie called home. For my grandfather, childhood wasn't played out in a backyard. It was played out across 70 rooms filled with cane stone, heavy velvets, and the oppressive silence of wealth so dense it muffled the sound of the city outside. While Reggie was still in short pants, his father, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, was the embodiment of the Protestant work ethic gone into overdrive. He was a man who lived by the clock. Every morning, he would leave the Fifth Avenue Palace to oversee the New York Central Railroad, managing a sprawling empire of steel and steam with a religious devotion to detail. He was a steward of the Commodore's legacy, consumed by the weight of maintaining the family's position at the top of the American pyramid. But Reggie was the youngest, the spare in an era that demanded little from spare sons other than a respectable appearance. In the grand hierarchy of the Vanderbilt dynasty, the roles were already cast. His older brother, Alfred, was being groomed as the crown prince. His brother Neely was the rebellious intellectual. Reggie was left in a peculiar vacuum. He was given every luxury but no mission. He grew up in the shadow of a father who was always working and a legacy that was already finished. There were no more railroads to conquer, no more rivals to crush, only a vast, golden ocean to float upon. The summers were even more surreal. The family would migrate to Newport, Rhode Island, to a cottage called The Breakers. I use the word cottage with the same irony my mother used to. It was a 4-story Italian Renaissance palazzo that required a staff of over 30 servants just to keep the dust off the marble. For young Reggie, this was the baseline of human existence. He watched Italian craftsmen spend years carving intricate designs into the ceilings. He saw his mother, Alice Gwynn Vanderbilt, presiding over dinners where the guest list was more exclusive than the College of Cardinals. In this environment, money lost its meaning. It wasn't something you earned. It was something that arrived, like the tide or the morning newspaper. His education followed the path of least resistance for the elite. Street Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire. It was an institution designed to polish the sons of the wealthy, to give them the manners of gentlemen and the connections of power. But as I look back through the records of that time, I see a glaring absence. There was no mention of the entrepreneurial fire that had driven the Commodore. Street Paul's taught Reggie how to quote the classics and how to wear a tailored suit, but it failed to teach him the one thing a Vanderbilt needed to survive the 20th century: the understanding that wealth is a living thing that requires care, or it withers. He was a Vanderbilt boy, a title that opened every door but required him to walk through none. He was pampered by nurses, dressed by valets, and shielded from the vulgarity of trade. While his great-grandfather had fought dockworkers and outmaneuvered titans in the mud of the New York waterfront, Reggie was being taught that a gentleman's hands should remain clean. He was being raised in a greenhouse, protected from the harsh winds of reality, unaware that plants grown without wind have no strength in their roots. I often imagine Reggie as a boy, sitting on the grand staircase of the breakers, watching the servants polish the silver. He saw the strength of the walls and the luster of the gold leaf, and assumed, with the innocent arrogance of a child, that it would always be there. He couldn't hear the hairline fractures forming in the foundation. He couldn't see that his father's exhaustion and his own lack of purpose were the first signs of a terminal decline. To Reggie, the mansion was a fortress. In reality, it was a beautiful, hollow shell, a monument to a past he didn't understand and a future he wasn't prepared to face. He grew up in a world where every whim was a command, never realizing that the most dangerous thing for a man is to have everything he wants and nothing to strive for. Within those magnificent marble walls, the air was rich with the scent of lilies and floor wax, but beneath the surface, there was only a profound and echoing emptiness. Chapter 3. The Yale Disappointment. In the autumn of 1899, New Haven was a city of stone spires and vaulted ambitions. My grandfather, Reggie, arrived at Yale University not as a student seeking knowledge, but as a deity descending from Olympus. In those days, a Vanderbilt entering a room didn't just command attention. He shifted the atmospheric pressure. His classmates, sons of the American elite themselves, reportedly voted him most likely to succeed. It is a detail that haunts me as a journalist, the sheer, blind faith we place in a name. They weren't voting for Reggie the man. They were voting for the $300 million they imagined stood behind him. But Yale, with its rigorous demands and hallowed halls of learning, required something Reggie simply did not possess: a sense of interior life. To sit in a lecture hall and debate the intricacies of political economy or the structures of Latin verse felt, to him, like a chore designed for the middle class. He was a creature of the senses, not the mind. While his peers were burning the midnight oil in the library, Reggie was discovering the intoxicating allure of the New Haven nightlife. He was learning that his signature on a tavern tab was more powerful than any grade on a transcript. The disappointment this caused his father, Cornelius II, is difficult to overstate. My great-grandfather was a man who viewed life as a series of ledgers to be balanced. He was a man of cold stone and iron rails, a man who believed that wealth was a fortress that required constant sentries. He watched Reggie's academic flippancy with a mounting sense of dread. For Cornelius, Yale was supposed to be the forge where Reggie's character was tempered. Instead, it became the place where the cracks in his foundation became visible to the world. The contrast between Reggie and his older brother, Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, was the central drama of the household. Alfred was the dutiful prince, the one who walked beside their father through the rail yards and sat quietly in the boardroom, absorbing the mechanics of power. Alfred understood that the Vanderbilt name was a debt that had to be repaid through service to the empire. He accepted the weight of the crown. Reggie, however, viewed the name as a golden key that should unlock only the doors to pleasure. After only 2 years, the pretense collapsed. Reggie dropped out. The official records are politely vague, citing academic difficulties or personal reasons. But the truth was far simpler. He was bored. The classroom offered no rush, no sudden spike of adrenaline. He was a man born at the finish line, so why bother running the race? When he packed his trunks and left New Haven, he wasn't just leaving a university. He was turning his back on the idea of a productive life. I can almost see the confrontation between father and son, the stern, aging titan behind a mahogany desk and the handsome, indifferent youth who had no defense for his failures. Cornelius saw in Reggie the very thing he feared most: the weak generation. He saw a boy who had inherited the Commodore's appetite for life, but none of his capacity for work. It was a failure of the bloodline, a biological glitch in the machinery of the dynasty. For Reggie, the exit from Yale was a liberation. He headed straight for the places where his name carried the most weight, and his responsibilities the least: the private clubs and the high-stakes gambling dens of New York and Saratoga. There, in the dim light of Lincrusta-walled rooms, amidst the click of ivory chips and the ritualized tension of the faro table, he found the purpose that had eluded him in the lecture halls of Yale. Gambling offered the one thing a Vanderbilt lacked: uncertainty. In a world where his clothes, his food, his social status, and his future were all guaranteed by birth, the card table was the only place where he could actually lose. He stepped out from the shadow of the university and into the neon glow of the underworld, trading the heavy books of New Haven for the sleek decks of the Song Bak. He didn't realize that he was walking away from the only structure that might have saved him. He had chosen the thrill of the wager over the dignity of the work, failing to understand that while a railroad can be built to last a century, a hand of cards is gone in a heartbeat. He had officially begun the process of trading his grandfather's iron rails for a gambler's fleeting luck, choosing a path paved with gold that led straight into the abyss. Chapter 4. The 1899 Inheritance Shock. The year 1899 was the year the clock finally stopped for the second Cornelius Vanderbilt. He died from a cerebral hemorrhage at the relatively young age of 55, exhausted by the sheer gravity of maintaining the world's most demanding fortune. For the family, it was a moment of profound mourning, but for the lawyers and the public, it was the beginning of the most scrutinized wealth distribution in American history. As a journalist, I've read through countless documents of financial ruin, but nothing is quite as chilling as a father's final judgment of his son, written in the cold, unyielding ink of a last will and testament. When the will was read, it wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was a public shaming of the spare heirs, the lion's share of the estate. A staggering $36,800,000 went to the responsible son, Alfred. He inherited the patriarch's seat, the Fifth Avenue mansion, and the reins of the New York Central Railroad. Alfred was given the empire. Reggie, on the other hand, was handed a message. He received $7,400,000. To any ordinary American in 1899, $7,400,000 was a sum of astronomical proportions. It was enough to build a dozen libraries or fund an entire university. But in the distorted, funhouse mirror reality of the Vanderbilts, this was a pittance. It was a deliberate, surgical strike by a father who knew his son was a liability. By giving Alfred 5 times the amount he gave Reggie, Cornelius was essentially telling the world that he did not trust his youngest child with the tools of the trade. $1,250,000 of Reggie's share was in liquid cash. The remaining $5 million was locked away in a trust fund. It was the 19th century version of an allowance for a child the father feared would burn down the house. I've often wondered if Reggie felt the sting of that rejection. Did he see the disparity in those numbers as a call to prove his father wrong? Or did he see it as a liberation from the burden of being the heir? As a reporter, I look at the data. Reggie was 19 years old. He had no degree, no job, and no intention of finding one. He had just been told, in front of the entire world, that he was worth 20% of his brother. For a man of Reggie's temperament, that kind of blow doesn't inspire reform. It inspires resentment. It fuels a desire to forget the judgment through the very vices that caused it in the first place. $7 million in 1899 had the purchasing power of hundreds of millions today. If Reggie had simply left that money in a conservative bond, my mother might have had that trust fund she told me didn't exist. But Reggie didn't see a legacy to be protected. He saw a ticket to the greatest party ever thrown. He saw a pile of chips on a table that had no end. The trust fund, which was meant to be a safety net, became his insurance policy, a guarantee that no matter how much he lost at the card table, he would never have to work a day in his life. It was a recipe for spiritual suicide. His father's death removed the last moral anchor from Reggie's life. Without the stern, judgmental eyes of Cornelius peering down at him from across the dinner table, Reggie was free to become the man he had always been in the shadows of New Haven. He was a millionaire at 19, an age when the human brain is barely equipped to handle the mechanics of a checking account, let alone a fortune that could alter the course of an industry. But Reggie had no interest in industry. He had an interest in movement, in the blur of a high-speed carriage, and the snap of a fresh deck of cards. I look back at the photos of him from that period. He was strikingly handsome, with the confident smirk of a man who believed the world owed him a living. He carried himself with a casual arrogance, a man who had never been told no by anyone who didn't share his last name. He took that $1,250,000 in cash and began to feed the beast. He didn't see the will as a warning. He saw it as an opening bell. The tragedy of 1899 is that it was the last chance for Reggie to change course. Had he been left with nothing, he might have found the Commodore's grit. Had he been left with everything, the responsibility might have crushed him into maturity. Instead, he was left with just enough to be dangerous, and not enough to be significant. He was given a fortune that allowed him to play the role of a titan without having to perform the labor of one. As he walked away from the reading of the will, Reggie Vanderbilt wasn't a man mourning a father. He was a man embarking on a 25-year mission to prove that his father's lack of faith was justified. He took the inheritance, a fragment of a railroad empire built on sweat and steel, and prepared to dissolve it in the bottom of a whiskey glass and the green felt of a gambling table. It was a legacy of distrust, carved into a bank account, a golden ticket to a spectacular, agonizingly slow disappearance. Chapter 5. The Prince of Gamblers. To understand the world my grandfather inhabited after the death of his father, one must look beyond the respectable facades of Fifth Avenue and peer into the discreet brownstone at number 5 East 44th Street. This was the domain of Richard Canfield, the Prince of Gamblers, a man who ran the most exclusive establishment in America. Canfield's was not a place for the common man. It was a sanctuary where the elite could indulge in their most expensive vices away from the prying eyes of the law. Inside, the walls were hung with Whistler paintings. The servants moved like ghosts in silk stockings, and the air smelled of the finest Cuban tobacco and vintage champagne. For Reggie, Canfield's was more than a club. It was his true home. It was here, in the dim, golden light of the gambling parlors, that he felt most alive. As a journalist, I've often explored the psychology of addiction, and in my grandfather's case, it was never about the money. A man born into $300 million does not gamble for profit. He gambles for the one thing a Vanderbilt can never naturally possess: the possibility of loss. In a life where every outcome was predetermined by his name, the green felt of the faro table offered the only true thrill of the unknown. The peak of this recklessness occurred on the night of January 14th, 1901, Reggie's 21st birthday. This was the milestone he had been waiting for, the day he officially gained control over the liquid portion of his inheritance. Most young men would celebrate their majority with a gala or a grand tour. Reggie celebrated by attempting to set fire to his fortune. That single evening at Canfield's, he lost approximately $70,000. To put that in perspective, $70,000 in 1901 was a king's ransom. It could have purchased a block of New York real estate or paid the annual wages of over 100 workers. Reggie lost it in a matter of hours. He sat at the table, his face a mask of aristocratic indifference, as the ivory chips were swept away by the house. He was looking for a bottom to his well of wealth, testing the limits of how much he could squander before the world finally said no. It was during these years that he earned the nickname the Preaching Faro Dealer. It was a bit of dark, society humor, a reference to his habit of holding court at the gambling tables, dispensing advice and stories with the gravity of a clergyman while the cards dealt out ruin. Faro was his game of choice. It was a fast, high-stakes game of chance where players bet on which cards would be drawn from a specialized dealing box. It was a game of pure probability, devoid of the strategy of poker or the nuance of bridge. It was exactly what Reggie wanted, a direct pipeline from his bank account to the abyss. But the $70,000 was only the tip of the iceberg. Reggie operated on a system of markers, essentially I-O-U-S, signed by a gentleman that promised payment at a later date. Because he was a Vanderbilt, his credit was considered as good as gold. By the time District Attorney William Travers Jerome began his crusade against illegal gambling, court records revealed that Reggie had accumulated a staggering debt of $300,000 to Richard Canfield. Think about that number, $300,000. In today's economy, that would be equivalent to several $1 million in gambling debts. Yet, When the scandal broke and the newspapers splashed the Vanderbilt name across the front pages, Reggie seemed unbothered. He eventually settled the debt for about $130,000, a discount granted by Canfield because Reggie was such a valuable magnet for other wealthy losers. The loss of his reputation mattered less to him than the loss of the rush. As I look back through the lens of a reporter, I see a man who was desperately trying to feel something in a world that had cushioned him into a state of permanent numbness. He wasn't just betting on cards. He was betting against the Commodore. He was taking the steel rails and the steamships that had been built with such brutal effort and turning them into ephemeral markers. He was the prince of gamblers because he had the most to lose and the least regard for keeping it. He sat in Canfield's brownstone, surrounded by the finest art and the most powerful men in the country, and he watched the wheel turn and the cards fall. Every loss was a small death, and every win was a distraction from the crushing weight of his own purposelessness. He was a man who had been given the keys to a kingdom and chose instead to spend his life in the counting room of a casino, trading his ancestors' labor for the hollow click of a roulette ball. He had exchanged the destiny of a dynasty for the fleeting high of the wager, never realizing that in the house of Canfield, just as in the house of Vanderbilt, the house always wins in the end. Chapter 6. Sandy Point Farm. The Lone Achievement. In the vast, tragic ledger of my grandfather's life, there is one entry that does not bleed red. It is the only place where the name Reginald Vanderbilt stood for something other than a punchline in a gossip column or a debt at a card table. That place was Portsmouth, Rhode Island, on a 280-acre expanse of coastal land known as Sandy Point Farm. Here, away from the suffocating expectations of Fifth Avenue and the illicit smoke of Manhattan's gambling dens, Reggie found the only thing that could command his focus: the hackney horse. As a journalist, I've often looked for the human element in my grandfather, the spark of competence that must have existed beneath the layers of excess. I found it at Sandy Point. This wasn't just a rich man's hobby. It was a sophisticated breeding operation that required a level of scholarly discipline. Reggie refused to apply to anything else. He didn't just buy horses. He studied bloodlines with the intensity of a monk, memorizing pedigrees back 6 generations. He became an expert in conformation, movement, and the subtle art of the carriage. The centerpiece of Sandy Point was a structural marvel that still stands today as a testament to his obsession. He commissioned a massive indoor riding arena, a cathedral for horses spanning 15,000 square feet. It was a space of breathtaking scale, dominated by gargantuan cypress wood beams that arched across the ceiling like the ribs of a great wooden whale. When you stood in the center of that ring, the air smelled of sweet hay, expensive leather, and the damp salt mist blowing off the Atlantic. The sound of hooves on the carefully raked dirt echoed against those cypress rafters with a rhythmic, percussive power. In this arena, Reggie was not the spare Vanderbilt or the preaching faro dealer. He was a master of his craft. He took the hackney horse, a breed known for its high-stepping, explosive gait and refined elegance, and turned Sandy Point into the premier breeding center in the United States. His commitment was so genuine that in 1917, he became the first president of the Association of American Horse Shows, the organization that would eventually become the United States Equestrian Federation, USEF. This wasn't an honorary title handed to a donor. It was a position earned through the respect of professional horsemen who recognized that Reggie Vanderbilt knew as much about a horse's hock as they did. He would spend hours in the stables, watching the grooms work, discussing the merits of a particular stallion with his farm manager. For a few hours a day, the glass of whiskey was set aside, and the deck of cards was forgotten. He was building something. He won blue ribbons at the National Horse Show in Madison Square Garden, competing against the best in the world and winning on merit. To see him in the driver's seat of a high-stepping carriage, his hands steady on the reins, was to see the man he might have been if the Vanderbilt fortune hadn't made effort unnecessary. But there is a bitter irony that I, as his grandson, cannot ignore. Sandy Point Farm was a temple of discipline built with the proceeds of total indiscipline. While he showed remarkable restraint in the breeding ring, the cost of maintaining those 280 acres was astronomical. He poured millions into the farm, money that was never intended to be recouped. Every ribbon won at Madison Square Garden probably cost him the equivalent of a small railroad station. He was treating the farm like a grand stage for his pride, a place where he could play the role of a productive titan without the vulgarity of actually turning a profit. Sandy Point was his sanctuary, but it was also a gilded trap. It allowed him to tell himself a lie, that he was a man of substance because he managed a staff of grooms and bred champion horses. It gave him a respectable veneer that shielded him from the reality that his capital was bleeding out. He was a president of an association, a leader in his field, and a champion breeder. But he was doing it all on a foundation of disappearing sand. As I reflect on the ruins of the Vanderbilt Empire, Sandy Point stands out as a beautiful, expensive mirage. It was the only place where Reggie's hands were truly busy. Yet even this achievement was funded by the slow cannibalization of his inheritance. He built a legacy on the backs of magnificent animals, pouring his soul into the elegance of their stride while his own life was stumbling toward a dark, lonely finish. He found his dignity in the stable, but he could not bring that dignity back to the house. It remains a haunting image, a man who could command 1,000-pound beast with a flick of his wrist, but could not command his own hand to put down the glass. His career was built majestically on the backs of horses, but in the end, it collapsed pathetically under the weight of the man. Chapter 7. The First Marriage, 17 Years of Decay. In 1903, the wedding of Reginald Vanderbilt and Kathleen Nielsen was marketed to the public as the union of two great American dynasties. It was a spectacle of Newport elegance, a ceremony designed to project stability and the continuation of the Vanderbilt lineage. But as a journalist who has spent a lifetime dissecting the masks people wear, I look at the photographs of that day and see something else. I see a young woman, Kathleen, stepping into a storm she was never equipped to weather, and a man, Reggie, who was already beginning to dissolve. Their marriage lasted 17 years, a duration that, in the context of their mutual misery, feels like a life sentence. While the public saw a couple attending the opera and summering in Rhode Island, the private reality was a slow-motion collapse. Reggie had brought his two primary companions from his bachelor days into the marriage, the bottle and the betting slip. For Kathleen, the sprawling Vanderbilt mansions didn't feel like palaces. They felt like vast, echoing theaters where she was forced to watch her husband's self-destruction in high definition. The most chilling aspect of Reggie's decline was the ritualization of his alcoholism. He didn't just drink, he curated his intoxication. His signature was the brandy milk punch, a deceptively smooth concoction of cognac, milk, sugar, and nutmeg. To an outsider, it might have looked like a sophisticated breakfast drink, but for Reggie, it was the fuel that allowed him to face the day. He would begin in the morning, the silver tray brought to his bedside by a valet, and he would continue until the world blurred into a comfortable, golden haze. I often reflect on the sheer loneliness Kathleen must have felt. To be a Vanderbilt wife was to be a symbol of American grace. Yet she spent her nights in a Fifth Avenue townhouse waiting for the sound of a carriage that might not arrive until dawn. When Reggie did return, he was often shadowed by the heavy scent of stale tobacco from Canfields and the glazed indifference of a man who had lost another five-figure sum at the tables. The family pleaded with him. His brothers staged interventions that were ignored with aristocratic politeness. Reggie was a man who viewed concern as an intrusion on his liberty. As the years ground on, the brandy milk punches moved from a morning ritual to a total lifestyle. Alcoholism is a thief that steals the personality before it steals the life. By his mid-30s, the athletic, handsome Heir who had charmed Yale was being replaced by a man with a bloating face and a trembling hand. The discipline he showed at Sandy Point with his horses never made the journey back to his marriage. He was a ghost in his own home, a tenant in a marriage that had become a legal formality. The emotional toll on their daughter, also named Kathleen, is a chapter of family history often skipped over. She grew up in a household where wealth was the only thing that wasn't scarce. Affection and stability were traded for expensive toys and trips to Europe. I see in this period the blueprint for the Vanderbilt curse. the idea that money can act as a substitute for character. Reggie believed that as long as the bills were paid and the staff was maintained, he was fulfilling his duty. He failed to realize that he was presiding over a home that was architecturally magnificent but spiritually bankrupt. By 1920, the pretense could no longer be sustained. Kathleen Nielsen filed for divorce. In that era, a Vanderbilt divorce was a seismic event, a public admission that even the greatest fortune in America couldn't buy a functional family. The settlement was reached behind closed doors, but the damage was visible to everyone. When the dust settled, Reggie walked away from his first marriage at the age of 40. He emerged from those 17 years as a shell of the man he had been at 21. His body was already beginning to betray him. The early stages of cirrhosis were likely already hardening his liver, a consequence of thousands of gallons of brandy and champagne. His inheritance, that once mighty $7,400,000, had been hacked away by nearly 2 decades of extravagant living, alimony, and the relentless, arithmetic cruelty of the gambling table. He had lost half his fortune and nearly all of his dignity. As a reporter, I've seen many people walk away from the wreckage of their lives, but Reggie's departure from his first marriage was particularly tragic. He wasn't looking for a fresh start or a chance at redemption. He was simply looking for a new audience for his decline. He had betrayed the trust of a wife and the potential of his own body, trading a lifetime of companionship for the fleeting, cold comfort of a glass. He stood at the midpoint of his life, a man who had spent 17 years perfecting the art of disappearing while standing still, a monument to the betrayal of both the heart and the flesh. Chapter 8. Gloria Morgan and the Final Mistake. By 1922, my grandfather was a man living on borrowed time and depleted capital. He was 42 years old, but the heavy toll of his brandy milk punches and the smoke-filled nights at the card tables had aged him well into a premature senescence. It was in this state of physical decay that he encountered Gloria Morgan. She was 18 years old, a girl of startling porcelain beauty who, along with her twin sister Thelma, had become the sensation of the international social circuit. The age gap was 24 years, a chasm of experience and vitality that should have signaled a warning to any rational observer. To Reggie, however, Gloria was a final, desperate chance to recapture the youth he had squandered. To Gloria, Reggie was the Vanderbilt name personified, a golden ticket to the apex of American society. Their marriage on March 6, 1923, was less a union of hearts and more a collision of illusions. As a journalist looking back at the records of their courtship, I see the tragic irony in every headline. My grandmother was a child of 18, stepping into the life of a man whose liver was already hardening into stone. She dreamt of Newport galas and Parisian shopping sprees, unaware that she was marrying into a funeral procession. Reggie, meanwhile, played the role of the generous benefactor, hiding the fact that his liquid assets were vanishing and his medical prognosis was dire. The couple settled into a townhouse at 12 East 77th Street in Manhattan, but the atmosphere inside those walls was far from domestic bliss. It was a death watch draped in silk and ermine. By the time my mother, Gloria Laura Vanderbilt, was born on February 20th, 1924, the man who sired her was a ghost of his former self. I find it profoundly moving and disturbing to think that my mother's first year of life was spent in a house where the scent of nursery powder mingled with the clinical smell of medicine and the stale odor of spirits. Reggie was often too ill to hold her, his hands trembling not from age, but from the systemic failure of a body that had been treated as an inexhaustible resource. Gloria Morgan found herself in a surreal position. She was a 19-year-old mother and a 20-year-old nurse to a dying titan. She was surrounded by the Vanderbilt trappings, the servants, the silver, the invitations, but the man at the center of it all was evaporating. Reggie continued to drink, even as his doctors issued their final, categorical warnings. He was a man who had never learned to say no to himself, and he wasn't about to start when the stakes were his own life. He clung to the bottle with the same grim tenacity he once used to cling to a losing hand at faro. During this period, Reggie made grand promises about the future. He spoke of the trust funds that would provide for little Gloria and the enduring wealth that would shield his young wife from the vulgarities of the world. He was a master of the Vanderbilt myth, projecting an image of infinite resources even as the bank ledgers told a different story. As a reporter, I've analyzed the math of his final years. He was spending capital, not interest. The $7,400,000 was no longer a mountain. It was a melting ice flow. He was promising a future built on a foundation that had already been liquidated at Canfields and Sandy Point. The townhouse on 77th Street became a gilded cage of anxiety. My grandmother, still a teenager in spirit, was forced to navigate the complex viper's nest of the Vanderbilt family, a group that viewed her with deep suspicion. They saw a fortune hunter from a family with more status than cash. She saw a family that had plenty of cash but no warmth. Caught in the middle was the infant Gloria Laura, the poor little rich girl in the making, whose very existence was a complication in a dynasty that was beginning to realize the money was running out. Reggie's physical state in 1924 was a secret guarded by the staff and the heavy curtains of the townhouse. His skin had taken on the sallow, jaundiced tint of end-stage cirrhosis. His movements were slow, his once sharp mind clouded by hepatic encephalopathy. Yet, he insisted on maintaining the pretense of the Gilded Age heir. He would dress for dinner, even if he couldn't eat. He would discuss the breeding of his hackney horses, even if he could no longer climb into a carriage. As I look at the portraits from that final year, the contrast is heartbreaking. There is Gloria Morgan, radiant and blooming with the terrifying optimism of 18. And there is Reggie, a man whose eyes reflect a profound, weary realization that he has reached the end of his chips. He had spent 45 years trying to escape the shadow of his father, only to end up as a cautionary tale for his own daughter. He had tied his fading, ruined legacy to the bright, unformed future of a teenage girl, promising her a kingdom that had already been gambled away. It was a tragic convergence of innocent youth and terminal decay. A final, doomed wager placed by a man who had forgotten how to do anything else but lose. Chapter 9. The Death at Rhode Island. The end did not come with the cinematic grandeur of a fallen titan. It arrived with the clinical, agonizing, slow-motion collapse of a biological machine that had been pushed far beyond its limits. In September of 1925, the air at Sandy Point Farm was beginning to turn with the first crisp hints of autumn, the kind of weather Reggie usually loved for driving his carriages. But the man who had once been the most recognized figure in American equestrian circles was no longer capable of holding the reins. At 45 years old, an age when the Commodore was just beginning his ascent, Reggie Vanderbilt was a broken man, sequestered in his bedroom as his body turned against itself in a final, irreversible rebellion. As a journalist, I have seen the grim reality of addiction in many forms, but the medical details of my grandfather's final days are particularly harrowing. Alcohol is a patient predator. For over 20 years, the brandy milk punches and the vintage champagnes had been scarring his liver, replacing healthy tissue with the hard, fibrous knots of cirrhosis. By that final month, the failure was systemic. His skin and the whites of his eyes had turned a haunting, sickly shade of saffron, a result of jaundice that no amount of Vanderbilt prestige could mask. His abdomen was distended, swollen with the fluid of ascites, making even the simplest breath a labor of monumental effort. Inside the master suite at Sandy Point, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of a death watch. My grandmother, Gloria Morgan, barely 21 years old, sat by the bed of a husband who looked like a man of 70. The doctors had long since stopped offering hope. They were now merely managing the exit. Reggie's mind, once quick enough to calculate the odds of a faro bank, drifted in and out of consciousness. In his lucid moments, did he look out the window at the paddocks and the indoor arena he had built? Did he realize that the magnificent hackney horses grazing in the distance were no longer truly his? On September 4th, 1925, the final hemorrhage occurred. Internal bleeding, a common and violent end for the chronic alcoholic, claimed what was left of his life. Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt died at the age of 45, leaving behind an 18-month-old daughter, a widow who had barely reached her majority and a financial wreckage that would shock the nation. The Vanderbilt luck had finally run out, and the bill for 25 years of unchecked hedonism was due for collection. The true tragedy, however, emerged in the cold light of the probate court. As a reporter, I have analyzed the ledgers of his estate, and the math of his ruin is staggering. When the lawyers began to peel back the layers of his finances, they found not a fortress, but a sieve. The $7,400,000 he had inherited in 1899 was gone. The grand promises of trust funds and eternal security had been built on a foundation of debt to satisfy the creditors, the tailors, the bootleggers, the stable hands, and the remnants of those gambling markers. The court ordered a total liquidation. The auction at Sandy Point was the final insult to his memory. The champion hackney horses, animals with pedigrees as long as his own, were led out of their stalls and sold to the highest bidder. The carriages with their custom brass fittings, the silver trophies, the very land itself, everything was scattered to the winds. It was a yard sale of a dynasty's pride. When the dust settled and the debts were cleared, the man who had been born into the richest family in the history of the world left behind a personal cash balance of only $130,000. $130,000. In the 1920s, that was a comfortable sum for a middle-class family, but for a Vanderbilt, it was the equivalent of a rounded error. It was less than he had lost in a single week at Canfield's in his youth. The $5 million trust fund established by his father remained, but it was locked away for his daughters. He had spent every penny of his own capital and a significant portion of what he was supposed to leave for his wife. He had entered the world with the resources of a king and departed it with the bank account of a shopkeeper. I think of him lying there in the silence of the Rhode Island coast, the sounds of the auctioneer's gavel still echoing in the future. He had spent 45 years trying to prove that he didn't need to be a railroad man, that he could define himself through pleasure and poise. But without the money, the poise vanished, and the pleasure became a poison. He had successfully dismantled the work of 3 generations in the span of one short, frantic lifetime. Reggie Vanderbilt died a millionaire in name only, a shell of a man whose primary achievement was the speed of his own evaporation. He was buried with all the pomp the family could muster, but the mahogany casket couldn't hide the truth that the Vanderbilt empire had suffered a mortal wound. He had played his final hand, and as the cards were turned over, the world saw that he was holding nothing but air. He vanished into the soil of Rhode Island, leaving behind a young widow, a poor little rich girl, and a name that had finally been stripped of its gold. Chapter 10. The Trial of the Century and the Final Void. The ghost of my grandfather did not find peace in the soil of Rhode Island. Instead, it returned 9 years later to haunt the halls of the New York Supreme Court. In 1934, the world was gripped by the Great Depression, a time of breadlines and broken dreams. Yet the public's attention was fixated on a 10-year-old girl, my mother, Gloria Laura Vanderbilt. The trial of the century, as the newspapers dubbed it, was a grotesque postscript to Reggie's life. It was a brutal custody battle between my grandmother, the young widow Gloria Morgan, and Reggie's sister, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. As a journalist, I've covered conflicts across the globe, but few things are as visceral as the documents from that trial. It wasn't just a fight over a child. It was a war over the $5 million trust fund Reggie had been unable to touch, the last remaining bastion of his father's fortune. Gertrude, a formidable woman who had built the Whitney Museum, viewed my grandmother as a cocktail-obsessed, neglectful mother who had squandered what little Reggie left her. The trial descended into a circus of scandal, with maids testifying about immoral behavior and secret European affairs. My mother, a fragile 10-year-old, was forced to testify in a judge's private chambers, her voice trembling as she chose between a mother she barely knew and an aunt who offered the cold stability of a museum. The court eventually awarded custody to Gertrude, branding my mother the poor little rich girl. But the real verdict was one of historical mathematics. I often look back at the family ledger with a sense of grim amusement. It is a simple, relentless equation that even a child could understand, yet it eluded the smartest men in our dynasty. The Commodore had built a fortune of $100 million through sheer predatory genius. His son, William Henry, doubled it. But by the time it reached the fourth generation, Reggie's generation, the philosophy of build and preserve had been replaced by spend and display. If you spend $5 when you are only earning $4, you will eventually reach zero. It doesn't matter if those dollars have 8 zeros behind them. The math of ruin is indifferent to your last name. Reggie was the personification of that deficit. He and his cousins treated the family capital as if it were a self-replenishing well, never realizing that the New York Central Railroad was no longer the undisputed king of American transport. They built chateaus on Fifth Avenue that cost $2 million to construct and another $100,000 a year to staff, all while the underlying source of their wealth was being eroded by automobiles, airplanes, and their own apathy. The final, staggering proof of this decline came in 1973. A family reunion was held at Vanderbilt University, bringing together 120 direct descendants of the Commodore. It should have been a gathering of the most powerful people in America. Instead, a reporter noted a chilling fact. Among those 120 descendants, not a single one was a millionaire. In less than 100 years, the greatest fortune ever assembled in the history of the world had been completely liquidated. It hadn't been lost in a single stock market crash or a great fire. It had been nibbled away by thousands of brandy milk punches, lost at faro tables, and spent on the maintenance of empty marble palaces. My mother lived through the wreckage of that explosion. She spent her life reclaiming her own identity, moving far beyond the poor little rich girl headlines to become an artist, a writer, and a designer. She was the one who taught me that a name is just a collection of letters if it isn't backed by your own work. When she told me there was no trust fund, it wasn't a lament, it was a liberation. She had survived the fall of the House of Vanderbilt, a collapse triggered by the man who had traded his daughter's future for a few more hours of preaching at a song back. Today, the Vanderbilt name belongs to the public. It belongs to the tourists who pay $30 to walk through the drafty corridors of the breakers and the students who walk the grounds of the university that bears the name. We are a family of museums and historical markers. The real legacy, the grit of the Commodore and the iron of the railroads, was dissolved long ago in the bottom of Reggie's glass and scattered across the paddocks of Sandy Point. I stand in the silence of these great stone houses and realize that Reggie's greatest wager wasn't at Canfield's. It was the bet he placed on the idea that a name could last forever without effort. He lost that bet, just as he lost all the others. The Gilded Age was a dream of permanence that ended in an auctioneer's gavel and a lonely death at 45. In the end, we are left with a haunting truth about the American dream, that glory is as fleeting as the scent of a hackney horse in the wind, and a dynasty built on gold is no match for a man determined to turn it all back into dust.